that the ANC throughout its history has fought for consistent equality. It has taken on different forms over its over 100 years of existence. For example, when it was formed in 1912, it didn't give women equal status to men, but eventually it did incorporate the equality of women. And then in 1943, we see the recognition of women, the non-racial policy of the ANC adopted with the Freedom Charter and beyond, Morogoro Conference. And as we were preparing during the 1980s and the early 90s for the emergence of a democratic constitution, the question about gay and lesbian rights. If one look at through the history, particularly during the 80s, someone like the late comrade Simon Ntuli, who was a member of the United Democratic Front, a member of the ANC underground, played an important role in raising the issues of the LGBTQI community within the ANC, as well as the broader UDF and mass democratic movement. And therefore, placing the issues on the agenda of the democratic movement and in the ANC, and hence we see our constitution, which is one of the only in the world that has that particularly highlight that we can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And therefore, it's included in our equality law, as well as some of the other progress that we made. But one of the things that the research and our discussion will have to address today is more than 25 years after democracy, the adoption of the Constitution, are we seeing the realization of those rights and frameworks set in the Constitution? And this is really what the research and our discussion is today. So a warm welcome to all our participants. And we will now start off by the presentation by Mpho Buntle, who will start off and give an overview of the research, and then we will get our respondents. Thank you very much, and over to you, Mpho.
Thank you very much, GM. To the Deputy Secretary General, Comrade Jesse Juwate, in absentia. I understand that she'll be joining us a little later. Our panelists, National Chairperson of Embrace Diversity Movement, Comrade Lgbtqi, and member of the African National Congress in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, Comrade Fasia Hassan, and representatives from Inclusive Society Institute present with us today. Let me just highlight that this study, more than anything, emerges out of a greater need to understand the lived experiences of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex plus community of South Africa. First, there's an acknowledgement that despite the constitutional recognition and protection, like you indicated, Comrade Phoebe, coupled with numerous pro-queer legislations, the lived experiences of the community still paint a picture of a community that remains to be subjected to many adverse predispositions. In our founding paper with Professor Brown, we are raising the need to explore this subject. And we argue that several of these predispositions are deep-rooted in colonial systems and institutional cultures that are antagonistic towards the LGBTQ community. Today, I present the findings of a study I led under the Inclusive Society Institute, and together with the leader of society, the African National Congress, we want to start unpacking the findings of this paper and also begin to agitate for the realization and delivery of the recommendations of the study. In the founding paper, we also put forward 7 pillars that we believe articulate the peculiar policy nuances that often disenfranchise the community as it relates to the provision and access to public services. It is important to note the other need was on investigating some, if not all, of these pillars at the backdrop of the devastating effects of COVID-19 on the community. Essentially, this period, beyond the many existing challenges that the community faces, presented a lesson to countries that the LGBTQ community was amongst those vulnerable communities hard hit by the devastating effects of the pandemic. The United Nations Human Rights reported in April that the LGBTQ community was particularly vulnerable during COVID-19 pandemic, both in terms of the socio-economic accesses and physical mobilities. This survey equally assessed the democratic consciousness, social cohesion, and integration, as well as the life experiences of the LGBTQ community. The overall study relies on these pillars identified by myself and Professor Brown, and they are as follows: education and youth development, access to healthcare and health services, safety, security, and psychosocial services, experiences when accessing essential services, homelessness and access to housing, job creation, employment, and access to the economy, and finally, queer migrants and asylum seeking. This study is offered as a contribution towards the important main study we envisage once the second phase of the overall study is concluded. In terms of the methodology, perhaps it is important to also note that there is very scant local research on queer experiences and overall research output in this regard. So in reviewing the South African LGBTI population size, we mainly relied on the United Kingdom Home Office report published in 2017. The report estimates that around 500,000 South Africans identify themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or gender non-conforming. We needed to test the validity of this estimate as well. We consulted another report by the other foundation together with the Human Sciences Research Council, which revealed a similar number of 530,000 adult men and women of all population groups, both rural and urban, across all age groups, self-identifying as either homosexual, bisexual, or gender non-conforming in some way. In terms of our sample and data collection, for this study in particular, we disseminated electronic questions to members of the LGBTQ community over a period of 2 weeks. This was done through LGBTQ organizations and networks across the country. This is a way to ensure quality of the sample, as well as ensuring that we get the lived experiences as it relates to the community. Targeting the community allowed us a better context and quality of experiences. Although the larger proportion represented cisgender males in terms of gender identity, there was, however, a good spread across the sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression spectrum. Also, the majority of responses came from individuals who consider themselves to be homosexual. In total, we received 288 valid responses drawn from across the country. We looked at confidence level and the measure of error. The Institute looks at the principle of the measure of error that is around 5%. So in determining the sample size, the Institute relies on the 95% level of confidence and 5% measure of error. Thus, in the case of the study, our level of confidence remains at 95%. Although the measure of error is at around 6%, we still deem it slightly lower that validates our findings in this regard. We had a number of limitations. Chief, the nature of the survey was done by means of electronic dissemination. This restricted the interpretation to be representative of those members of the community with access to electronic communication. Whilst proactive steps have been taken to ensure integrity of the data, and all indications are that the data is beyond reproach, the possibility of data manipulation externally cannot be completely excluded. The survey presented 32 questions grouped into 7 categories. Questions of a demographic nature, questions relating to constitutional and democratic rights, questions relating to social cohesion and integration, questions relating to attitudinal changes in South Africa, questions relating to the family environment, questions relating to health, as well as questions relating to the impact of COVID-19. Given that just half the responses were received from the Gauteng province, with the balance spread across the remaining provinces, it was important to do sampling within the Gauteng province itself in order to ascertain whether the national average was reflected in the provincial results as well. We look at the key findings now. There's about, our report is about 35 pages, so I'll just touch on key findings. The overwhelming majority indicated that they were aware of their constitutional rights as it relates to gender identity and sexual orientation. Thus, 86% are aware of their rights, when 14% are not. There's, however, no correlation with their belief that these rights are adequate. 51% believe it to be adequate, whilst 41% believe it to be not to be adequate. This suggests that policymakers need to further understand policy gaps that exist. They may be real or perceived. Despite this balance, it appears that the community requires from government additional policy work, policy implementation, and enforcement. Although there is awareness of rights and beliefs that policy is sufficient, it seems to be failing the implementation test. When looking at the lived experiences of the community, only 34% feel free to express their sexual orientation and or gender identity, whilst 24% feel subtle, bias, and or discrimination, and 18% feel mistreated or discriminated. The large majority of the LGBT community feel that they are not fully part of the society. 72% have experienced discrimination in terms of social integration. This discrimination is seen to be found across a broad range of areas, but attention is given to the following 3 areas: education and youth development at 69%, safety, security, and psychosocial services at 65%, and housing at 56%. Just under half of these respondents, at about 48%, said they have experienced discrimination in terms of access to healthcare and health services, whilst 31% of them cited access to essential services, 22% job creation, employment, and asylum seeking as areas of discrimination. Findings indicate that the majority does not consider either government, departments, or private and non-profit organizations or non-government organization sector as main perpetrators of discrimination, but rather individuals as main purveyors, with 78% having experienced discrimination from individuals in these spaces. Nevertheless, the levels of discrimination experienced across both public and private sectors remain a cause for concern and deserve great attention. The study also highlights that the ability for the community to exercise their cultural practices and or religious beliefs remains a stumbling block in pursuit of social cohesion. 59% experience some form of rejection and discrimination when wanting to exercise their cultural rights, 67% when wanting to express their personal religious beliefs. In terms of attitudes, there's been material shift in society's acceptance of LGBTQ since the advent of democracy in 1994. 78% were of the opinion that there was a greater level of societal tolerance. 92% believe attitudes were improving, while 8% believe that there's no real change. The results suggest that while South Africa is certainly advancing in terms of the promotion of LGBT rights and inclusion, there is still some way to go before the community will feel completely included as full members of society. In terms of fair treatment, there's 54% who are of the opinion that government departments treated them fairly when accessing services, while 70% believe that they're treated fairly in the private sector when accessing services or procuring products or goods. In terms of family environment, generally speaking, the LGBTIQ community reported to function within a healthy family environment. 65% said they were accepted, 86% said they were in happy relationships with family and friends, 18% reported that they were abused in any way in a domestic environment. This abuse varies across different responses. There's 39% of this 18% who were abused physically, 92% of them psychosocially, and 24% of them on other forms, such as withholding finances and verbal insults. In terms of health, the majority reported to be healthy. Non-mental health at 73%, where 73% rather reported no adverse medical conditions, and 59% said they had no mental health conditions. What is alarming, however, is that from those who indicated some form of adverse health conditions, there's a challenge. We did a deeper analysis of age segmentation. In the age group 25 and under, 20% had no mental adverse health conditions, 53% had some form of adverse mental health condition. In the age group 36 to 55, 28% had no mental adverse health conditions, whilst 36% experienced some form of adverse mental health condition. In the age group 55 and above, 13% reported non-mental health and 33% adverse mental health conditions. These numbers point to a significant finding. Adverse mental health conditions are prevalent and alarming among young people under the age of 26 in the community, creating a potential mental health crisis in the making. In terms of COVID-19, here we address three topics. The first, what is the level of support among members of the LGBTI community for measures taken to combat COVID-19? Second, how has these measures impacted their livelihoods? And last, to what extent has it affected their domestic relationships? A majority supports the measures at 69%. Nevertheless, a third of the respondents at 31% indicated that they were not in favor of these measures. Higher than earlier, in a study conducted by ISI in June 2020, The survey looked at members of the African National Congress and supporters, and it found that only 4% of respondents were not in favor of these measures. It is different in our study. This support does not ignore the persisting material impact that the measures have had on the income and livelihoods of the LGBTI community. 72% of the respondents indicated that the measures taken by government had negatively affected them in terms of their income and livelihoods, while 70% indicated that they did not have difficulties in accessing services or basic services. While 70% indicated that they did not have difficulties in accessing basic services, 30% did. There's 66% who faced discrimination in terms of health services, 52% in terms of security services, 77% in terms of social services, excluding food, and 79% in terms of accessing food during the COVID-19. Testing and national validity, as indicated earlier on, that half of the respondents came from Gauteng province. The study needed to conclude whether Gauteng outcomes did not distort the national outcome in any way. To this end, the data of 6 questions was analyzed and compared to the national outcome, so as to enable a consideration as to whether the variations impact the validity of national results. From this analysis, it is evident that the lived reality of the community in Gauteng mirrors that of the national LGBTIQ community. The Institute is of the opinion that in light of the clear trends across data sets, the validity of the national trends have been confirmed. In the opinion of the Institute, the national results can be relied upon. In conclusion, I'll just go through the recommendations. There still remains material disparities between constitutional and legislative framework in relation to advancement of LGBTI rights and critical implementation and execution of these rights with both public and private spheres of society. We present the following recommendations. First, the Department of Public Administration needs to design and implement an awareness program aimed at sensitizing the public service as to the rights of the LGBTI community to receive equal and quality service from all civil servants. The department should also develop a reporting and monitoring mechanism aimed at ensuring adherence to the constitutional and legislative obligations of the public officials, looking as well at issues of autonomy and many other service charges presented by departments. More generally, all governments, departments, and provinces need to ensure the mainstreaming of issues of LGBTI in all policies. It is further recommended that the Commission for the Protection of Cultural and Religious and Linguistic Communities prioritize engagement aimed at eliminating vestiges of discrimination within religious and cultural identities. Other Chapter 9 institutions include the South African Human Rights Commission and the Commission for Gender Equality. They also have a role to play in creating awareness. And the second recommendation is on extending the deepening of the 7 pillars that I spoke about earlier on through the focus groups. Additionally, it is proposed that a further focus group must be established to examine the prevalence of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and hate crimes. We believe that the work of the National Task Team on Hate Crimes by the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development will aid the work of this focus group. Last, as highlighted during data analysis, we found extreme findings in relation to the presence of adverse mental health conditions amongst the LGBT community in general, but especially amongst the under 26 age group at 53%. Therefore, we propose that the Department of Health must commission a study, amongst others, to gain fuller understanding of the causes and potential remedial policies and interventions that could be designed to mitigate against these acute disorders. That's how I present the research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that is quite extensive, and we will share the more detailed research, because this is just a snapshot of as you can hear from Paul's presentation, about quite extensive research. So what we have is some of the issues, because this is a barometer of what the issues are within the community in a particular point in time. We looked at issues about awareness of right, experience of discrimination, integration into society, questions of attitudes, access to services, abuse, mental health issues, and then of course the specifics in terms of COVID-19 and the era that we are in now. In addition to that, the research also made recommendations, particularly with regards to making sure that this disparity that there is between a constitutional framework that guarantees rights and laws and implementation, and a specific recommendations with regards to making sure that the public service department ensure mainstreaming across departments, but also education of public servants to be able to ensure that there's sensitivities to these issues and to combat discrimination, and then a way of monitoring the issues, a campaign against discrimination through our different Chapter 9 institutions, and then finally that we need a further study from the Department of Health about the mental issues that were raised, mental health issues that were raised with regards to particularly the younger segment of this community. Before I hand over to our panel, I just want to acknowledge some of our participants who's part of our Zoom platform. Queenie Madikizela, welcome. Good to have you on the platform. Comrade Faiz Jacobs, a member of the Provincial Legislature in Western Cape. Mr. Darryl Swanepoel, who is the Executive Director of the Inclusive Society Institute, under whose umbrella the research was done, as well as I think that there are a few colleagues from the Women's League, as well as other organizations. Thank you so much, Precious. I see we will acknowledge people as we go along, Ms. Stemmet, etc. But a warm welcome to everybody that has joined us. I'm now going to hand over to our first panelist, who is Comrade Steve Letseke, who is the chairperson of the inclusive, chairperson that participate in the ANC structures, that participate as a very vocal voice in broader civil society around the issues of the LGBTQI community, and certainly an activist and an intellectual in his own right. So over to you, Comrade Steve.
Thank you so much, Comrade Phoebe, who's the moderator for the session, and of course to recognize in absentia Comrade Jesse Duarte, DSG, and Comrade Phoebe. Let me also recognize fellow panelists who joined this session, members of the ANC, of the Embrace Diversity who have joined as well as members of provincial legislatures, and also of the Institute, Inclusive Institute Society or officials who are here. Comrade Phoebe, let me appreciate the effort by Comrade Paul Bunte and Professor Anthony Brown for, through the Inclusive Society for conducting this research. I mean, it's quite an important research, that is taking place during this outbreak and also during a time of crisis. And I think it's quite important, to recognize the fact that many LGBTI person have been particularly vulnerable, during this COVID. I mean, in the space of civil society that I work with, we have received quite a lot of cases of reporting of discrimination and human rights violation. And I think a country like ours, such as South Africa, that has a globally celebrated constitution, this constitution should become a lived reality for many. But I think during this time of COVID pandemic, we've seen the vulnerability increasing. And many of the LGBTI persons who also are living with the compromised immune system, including some persons living with HIV, some are living with non-communicable diseases. And I think we know that South Africa is faced with many pandemics. COVID is not the first one. We have HIV, we've got tuberculosis that we're dealing with, we've got non-communicable diseases, we've got gender-based violence, and we've got and many injuries that are caused by reckless driving. And these are pandemics that we are dealing with. And now COVID coming in is an added reality. And I think what is quite important about the research, the fact that, the researchers looked at various thematic areas, beyond demographic, but looking at social and structural drivers of vulnerabilities and looking at the reality and the impact of COVID-19 itself. And I think it's to also acknowledge, from this research, the many challenges that have been touched. Access to health services has been one of the biggest issues, not only just during COVID. And I think now, given the COVID era, it affirms exactly what has been happening now in a visible manner. The fact that LGBTI people regularly experience stigma and discrimination while seeking health services, leading to inequalities in accessing quality and available health care. I think it's one of the biggest challenges. There are pockets of excellence that we note in various provinces and municipalities. There are excellence centers of excellences that have been developed over the years. However, I think largely in the public health sector, we're still struggling with stigma and discrimination. And I think this is one of the issues around how do we address sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, that people find, exacerbated through negative reaction in the health aspect. And what we see, the more we see lack of access to health services, the more we see or we find very low or health outcomes for LGBTI persons. And then I think this is quite important to note, because part of it is that it's not only just around the need to fast track the national health insurance, that the ANC has also been championing and government has put forward in parliament processes. I think it's quite important that NHI be in place and be inclusive as fast as possible. But I think part of it is not only just to deal with this crisis. We are seeing more and more deprioritization of required health services by LGBTI persons. Our health system already is overloaded. The treatment of LGBTI persons, is interrupted in the health system itself. But not only just for COVID services. COVID services are accessible, but now the issues around HIV treatment, testing, hormonal treatment, gender affirming treatments for transgender persons. These on its own and deprioritization that is happening. In South Africa, we've had only about 4 hospitals, one in Cape Town, the rest are in Gauteng, So that means out of 9 provinces, 2 are only providing gender-affirming treatment for a transgender person, which is a big concern for a country that has a legislative framework since 2003, which is a sex reassignment law in place. But such decisions of scaling down should be really challenged and should be, reflected in whether we are serving the LGBTI persons accordingly. But some of the things that the research is raising, and I think we need to think about it in a very broad lens, where we address stigma, discrimination, the hate speeches and attacks that LGBTI people fear. I think it's really quite problematic in how we respond to effectiveness of addressing the emergency element of it. The issues around violence, domestic violence and abuse, due to stay-at-home restriction, many LGBTI young people are confined in hostile environments with unsupportive families. And these are family members or cohabitant or guardians who are homophobic. And this increases their exposure to violence as well as anxiety and depression. And I think moderator and facilitator for the session, is quite important to think about it, because there's a direct and indirect conversion therapy that has been happening at home. People are rejected at home. That leaves also many LGBTI person homeless. And I think this is one of the key issues when you look at how the COVID response has been dealt with. Many homeless people have been moved around to one confined areas where even the fact that some of the people who are there are LGBTI, and they will be even exposed to more violence across the issue. And I think we are hearing it with the fear of some of the respondents of this research. The other issue that came out, which I think is critical, it's the issue of access to work, food security, and livelihood has been challenged during this time. LGBTI people, many who are unemployed, but some who are in the workspace, are also now exposed to, the reality of poverty, than the general population. And of course, the general population also are experiencing that. And there's no way we can ignore that. It's an issue that challenges everyone. But many of the LGBTI people who work in the informal sector and lack access to paid compensation and coverage of some of the benefits, it's such a challenging time, and we see it based on inequality. And sometimes some of this inequality happens in intersectional lens, that one is a woman, is working in informal settlement sector, but also as well as being lesbian. So the intersectionality of this component is quite important to recognize. I want to make some recommendations which are quite important for consideration. And these are actions that government must think about, in recognizing the needs and responding to the needs of LGBTI persons in this case. And these are specific efforts that must be done by government to put in place measures, to put in place clearly defined measures that addresses and ensures LGBTI people are not subjected to discrimination, and also fear of retribution of seeking healthcare services. Health services are particularly relevant to everyone, but also to LGBTI people, and should not be prioritized on a discriminatory basis. But secondly, is that measures to address the socioeconomic impacts of the epidemic itself should consider particularly the vulnerabilities of LGBTI persons, including older persons, homeless, and ensure LGBTI people are fully covered in this. And I think also to the ANC political leaders and other influential figures should speak out against stigmatization and hate crime. I mean, currently, government has put in place 3 violence-related bills, and they are discussing this currently. I don't understand why we have not even included hate crimes as a hate crimes bill and hate speech as part of the package of responding to violence, because that is directed to LGBTI persons, even during the context of the pandemic. The last 2 points that I want to make, it's really around the issues of shelters, support services, and other measures to address gender-based violence during this time. Many LGBTI who are kicked out should have a place of safety. And these shelters that are here and across the country do not necessarily accommodate LGBTI persons. And that's the biggest issue. The last one is that, the emergency measures that have been put in place should guarantee the rights, and apply these rights of LGBTI persons. The human rights are not disconnected. And I think it's quite important to ensure that there's protection for transgender and gender non-conforming persons. The laws must be enforced and should really be instructed and trained, even law enforcers being trained around the issue. So I want to really just make this recommendation for consideration, but at the same time welcome this research, because it advances and builds on the work or body of work that has been done. Thank you so much, Comrade.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I think that the issues that you're raising around the fact that we have many public health challenges, that COVID-19 is the major pandemic at the moment, but it needs to be linked to other public health challenges, both communicable as well as non-communicable diseases. The fast tracking of the NHI, deprioritization of other forms of treatment, as well as the issues around hate speech, domestic violence, homelessness, and the recommendation that she made. I think that for me, the one major takeaway is the interconnectedness between and amongst rights, which is really important. You can't look at the one without looking at the other. You can't look at social cohesion without making sure that you address homelessness and discrimination, for example. Thank you very much. And I think that the issues raised are certainly the issues that the Embrace Diversity movement stands for and that advocate for. Our next respondent is the collaborator with Mpho Bunze on the research, Professor Anthony Brown from University of Johannesburg. Prof, are you here?
Comrade Phoebe, I understand Prof has an engagement that quickly came out from the university. So,
okay, so we'll move on. Fazia, are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, go for it.
All right. Actually, I was going to say that one of the things of us speaking last is that you always run the risk of sort of some repetition. So I'm going to do my best to try and cover it, hopefully then from a slightly different angle. I found the paper quite interesting. I think my initial thoughts were that I expected it to be a lot more damning, in that some of the stats that came out around the levels of comfortability and the some levels of acceptance, I found higher than what I expected. I think I expected a much worse scenario. And that could be because of our interactions with community activists. It could also be with our interactions with NGOs, or it could also be that the sample size maybe didn't touch everyone that we needed it to touch. But that being said, I still think it was a very interesting exercise. And I just want to also start by saying this is exactly what I think the ANC needs to be doing more often, engaging in specific research that informs policy position and also informs actual executive implementation. So I think that's a very good starting point. But the truth is, as much as there is overall acceptance, according to what the paper is saying, I think we also need to be honest and talk about the fact that there's still huge levels of intolerance. And it's also, I think, particularly worrying that not just to us as the ANC, but also to the state, that we're seeing numbers or people saying they feel more accepted in the private sector, marginally so though, but feeling more accepted in the private sector than they do in the public. And I think that's a cause for introspection, because we always tend to say that as members of the ANC, we should be the most progressive of society. We should be leading society in a particular direction, whether it be about the LGBTQIA+ community, whether it be about the decriminalization of sex work, whether it be about other, inverted commas, controversial ideas in society. It should be the ANC at the forefront. And by extension, because we're the governing party, it should also be in the state. So what we're hearing from the research is also quite troubling, in that we need to do a lot more work internally. And I'll speak to it in a moment, what I think needs to happen internal to the party vis-a-vis internal to the state, about what we need to do. But it's also very clear that government officials or public officials who hold some sway, and I'm not just talking about elected officials, I'm talking about nurses, police officers, officials who serve the public, perhaps in home affairs, for example. What are their attitudes towards the LGBTQIA+ community? What levels of discrimination are experienced there? And I think the study is quite good in highlighting that there's general dissatisfaction, of course, with some level of service delivery, but it's particularly acute for the LGBTQIA+ community. And I think that's something we also need to consider, because it's not just about blanketly delivering services. It's about understanding that if there's a marginalized group, that we put in further intervention to make it easier and more possible to access those services. And I found that level of the research particularly useful and particularly interesting as a lawmaker, as a policymaker as well. So I think that's very important. But of course, linking to what I was saying now around people not feeling that the public sector is necessarily as welcoming. Yes, there's an acknowledgement that it's more of the individuals versus the institution itself. But I still think that there's a lot of work that we need to do to sensitize and conscientize, because we cannot be drivers of that change if this kind of thing continues in our ranks. And I think we also need to have an honest and open discussion about, let's say we have a member of the LGBTQI+ community, or someone who identifies as gay, for example, who's running for office within the ANC. As much as we'll say on a public platform we support them, what is the average branch member going to say? What is the average card-carrying member of the ANC going to say? And I'm going to hazard that they're not going to be the most progressive. And that's also indicative of the fact that we need to be doing work internal to our organization, as well as doing work in society, as well as doing work in the state. Because right now we don't necessarily have a leadership that's necessarily reflective of that. As much as we talk the right talk, and I think we're starting to see politicians and lawmakers, we're starting to say the right things, we're starting to acknowledge the community. But until there's power behind that, and until there's fundamental or substantive change behind it, it's going to remain conversational, and it's going to remain something that just gets said. So yes, the fact that we cannot be the most progressive in society unless we're doing that internally. Right, I also wanted to talk a little bit about targeted policy, because this is something the research is speaking to, and something that I fully agree that we need targeted policy. And I think Comrade Steve spoke about it as well, around health and around social issues, that we can't apply a blanket approach that we have at the moment and assume that that sort of serves the needs. Not at all. What's also clear is that as much as we have a legislative framework that seeks to protect the community, in reality and in implementation, we're not seeing that actually translate on the ground. And I think that's where we need to be focusing our attentions in between, those cracks between the two different sort of sectors. And of course, ultimately, we need to lead to, or rather the goal should be something around social integration, social cohesion. It shouldn't just be about acceptance. I think for me, integration is more important or less so than focusing on assimilation, which I think about when I just think about acceptance, right? It's about being a meaningful part of society, not just merely accepting or just turning a blind eye to it. So I think that's particularly important. But I also wanted to speak a little bit about this conscientization. I keep talking about the sensitization that also the report spoke of. And I think we need a multi-pronged approach at this as well. We need a mass education program that focuses on society, but I'm also thinking that there's a lot we can utilize with the media. And I'm not just talking about news media, I'm actually thinking beyond that. The SABC and, okay, now it's more Mzansi Magic, but we're seeing a lot of content coming out of there that could help not just normalize, but bring people into the modern day and bring people to be in a space where they're more open to different ideas. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we tend to try and bring about social change in a very polarizing manner, right? We have lots of political education, and I'll speak to that also in a second, but we approach it from a very narrow lens of it being only political in nature. Whereas I think if we think a little bit more creatively and we start doing different content creation so that people see it on their TVs, they hear it in their radios, they see it on their social media, we'll be able to really start changing society in a different way. So we're not just bringing about that message through a government billboard or government program, we're reinforcing it as well. And sure, some people may argue that this was something that was used by, sort of communist states. We know that China does this, etc. But when it comes down to progressive ideas, and when it comes down to bringing about safety and openness and inclusiveness in our society, I think it's something that we really need to consider. And of course, internal to the ANC, I do think that we need to have a targeted political education program. Many people don't understand the difference between gender identity, between sexual orientation, between actual biological sex. And that tends to sort of fog these sorts of conversations, because we're not even educating the average branch member about what's going on and why as much as we may have progressive ideas on a policy conference, but is that actually what's believed on a community level? Because we know our branches are very much reflective of society and tend to be very religious in nature, very theological in nature. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be religious. I'm saying that we need to acknowledge that sometimes means that there's homophobia on that level. And that's something that we need to do, or we need to work on, I think, internally. So yes, the laws provide us with a framework. They provide us with the tools to build a better society. But the ultimate truth is that we need a lot more effort as members of our communities, as both individuals and otherwise, as members of the ANC, as the governing party and of the state. Our efforts need to come together in our societies to make those laws real. Because until the lived experience of a young person in a township is not one of fear, we can have the best laws in the world, we can have the best policies in the world, but the reality is that nothing would have changed on the ground. And I often think about, at least I thought about this when I was reading the paper, around the fight in the Muslim community to bring about more progressive Islam, one that's more inclusive and open. And I cite that because you need a number of different tactics. You need knowledge and information, but you also need to be knocking on doors and speaking directly to people. A bit like what the ANC and the UDF did in the fight against apartheid. These mass conscientization campaigns is something that I think we need to consider quite seriously. And the benefit now of being in 2020 is that we can utilize a whole lot of other technology and media to make it easier for us. And ultimately, I think, the point that I'm making is that we need to introspect. I think we need to introspect both on a cultural level, a religious level, and even in our homes and even at work, even in social circles. People perpetuate very problematic ideas on a daily basis around how they refer to friends, how they refer to partners, sexual and otherwise. And that's why I think there's also a huge space for us to really do a lot of work. I'm trying not to repeat, so I'm just quickly going through my notes. This is my last point, and then I'll close. We need to constantly, and now I'm putting on my cap as an MPL, we need to constantly introspect and understand whether we as lawmakers, and also in our oversight capacity, whether we are asking the right questions of the executive. So I'll give you an example. In the portfolio committees I sit, I regularly ask about the representation of the LGBTQIA+ community. But I'm starting to think, especially after reading this research, that that's not the right question to ask. That we need to have targeted specific programs and other more particular indicators in how we measure government progress and success, so that it's not me asking ad hoc. It's saying, well, in every quarter, what are we doing? What programs do we have? What is like the substantive change that we're putting across? And I think that's something that we need to also consider putting, not just in Gauteng, but of course across the country. So playing our oversight, monitoring and evaluation role in a far more meaningful way. And of course, constantly interrogating our work. We have to challenge ourselves. And I think that's not something we've done enough of. But I think I've spoken a mouthful, and I also don't want to repeat what Comrade Steve has said. And I have some suspicions that what I haven't covered will probably come up in some Q&A. So let me hand back, but thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Fazia. So what we will, I think that the issues that Fuzzy has raised with regards to targeted policy, the role that we can play, will hopefully come out in the, it's not just Q&A session, it's also inputs, other recommendations that our participants have. And Rafiel, we will also look for us on Facebook if there's any questions. But it seems to me that there's a couple of issues that I think that we may want to reflect on. The first one is the question about discrimination in public services. And I think that Fasia, as well as Steve, correctly raised, you know, police persons, the housing departments, home affairs departments, health departments, and health professionals, educators, social workers, etc., play a very important role in terms of mass public services. If we have a research that say that people feel that they have more access in the private sector than in the public sector, what's the problem and how do we address it? So that's the first issue. The second issue is how do we change attitudes in society? And the research, as well as our two respondents, raised the question that we shouldn't just look at assimilation, that you need to come and assimilate into a society as is, but that we look at how do we ensure, in a real sense, embrace diversity. How do we do mass conscientization and political education around understanding issues of different gender identities, and so forth, and how do we educate our members, society around those issues. The question of hate crimes were raised, that we need to be much more assertive around it and condemn it, but also the role of media, the public broadcaster, as well as religions in terms of addressing these issues. We also have to look at the role of Parliament. Parliament has an oversight role. It has access to the administration and can ask questions. It can also visit specific communities. So we need to look at what are the indicators that they're supposed to look at, and how do we, so that it has a transformative impact and not just ticking boxes. And then the final issue is, which wasn't really raised by any of the speakers, but the question I'm wondering, because this is a session of the ANC, we have quotas for women, we have quotas for people with disabilities, we have quotas for to make sure that we cover the entire country, that with regards to young people, etc., etc. Why have we not considered a quota for the LGBTQI community? Because the assumption is that they will just emerge through the ranks of the ANC, even though we acknowledge that we have members with different gender and sexual identities within the ANC. So that's a question. I now open the floor for discussions, questions, contributions. Just raise your hand or on your device for contributions. Okay, are there any hands? Have the speakers and participants cover all of you? I can't believe it. Comrade Faiz, is he still here? Oh, okay, I don't see him here. Anybody else that want to make a contribution? Really, did the speakers cover all of you? Or do we have a challenge of raising hands? Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, so if there are no questions, as we said, firstly, the report is available on the Inclusive Society website, which is www.inclusivesociety.org.za. www.inclusivesociety.org.za, and we'll also share it on the My ANC Facebook page, where this video is being streamed, and you can see the full report there. The second issue is that this is the first part of a research. The first part was the survey that Paul presented and which we discussed today. The second part is focus group to get behind some of the issues that's being raised. For example, the fact that such a high amount of young people from the community report mental health issues, the questions around access to services, the question around discrimination and violence. So we will be having a second bite at this research once we have the focus group research back, and we can then look at the researchers will then look at the issues more integrated. But I think that in the meantime, the recommendations that have been made around addressing issues around the public service, the question that Steve raised around why, when we have 3 bills to look at how do we strengthen action against gender-based violence, why are we not using these opportunities to also address hate crimes against the LGBTQI community, and use this opportunity and not just wait in 2 years' time or whenever time to do that. So we need to look at that and see what are the opportunities and to be able to take those issues forward. And I see Wendy is here, who is head of our research. I'm sure he will take those issues forward. The question about the ANC, the role of the ANC, not just as a governing party, but also within our own ranks. How do we fight against homophobia in our own ranks? How do we educate our members? How do we ensure that our members who are lesbian, gay, transgender, etc., are able to find a home within the organization, a voice in the organization, and also form part of our public representatives, of our leadership, of our members, and at all levels of the organization. And then, of course, the issue that's been raised with regards to oversight. Let me start off by saying thank you very much to the Inclusive, on behalf of the ANC, to the Inclusive Society Institute, Daryl Swanepoel, Edwin, for spearheading this research and for the work that has been done, to Mpho, who is the lead researcher, together with Professor Brown, in bringing the idea of doing this research about a very critical part of our communities, and shining a spotlight on an issue which, as a democratic and inclusive society, we need to look at as we look at transforming our society, particularly in the time of COVID. A special thank to Steve Lgbtqi and Fazia Hassan for reading the report and your thoughtful inputs as well as recommendations. And then a special thank you to all our participants on Zoom as well as on Facebook for being part of this. You can read the full report on the Inclusive Society website, www.inclusivesociety.org. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Wear your mask, physical distance, and hand hygiene, and stay safe. Thank you very much and have a good evening.